February 19th, 1942, Australia. The day war came where no one expected it. Darwin, a small town on the northern edge of the continent, a place that seemed safe, far from the carnage. People were waking up as usual. Workers were heading to the docks. Children were rushing to school. Mothers were making breakfast. No one knew that in a few hours the city would turn into hell. At 9:58 a.m., they appeared on the horizon. At first, barely discernible dots in the blue sky. Then, closer and closer. 188 fighter jets. They were Japanese Zeros, Vals, and Kates. Fighters and bombers, the same machines and the same pilots who had bombed Pearl Harbor 3 months earlier. Only now they were flying over Australia. At first, people in the city didn't understand what was happening. Some thought it was the Americans, flying in for training. Others hoped it was a mistake. But then the bombs started exploding. The first strikes hit the port. Ships burst into flames, one after another. Black smoke rose high into the sky. It could be seen for tens of kilometers. Then the bombs began falling on the city, on houses, on streets, on hospitals. In the first hour of fighting, more than 250 people died. This number seemed unthinkable for a small Australian town. Hospitals were overwhelmed with the wounded. The streets were littered with rubble. People fled their homes, unsure where to go. Cars jammed the roads, trying to leave the city. Mothers screamed, children cried. It was chaos, panic, fear. But 2 hours later, things got even worse. A second wave, 54 aircraft from airfields in occupied Indonesia. They bombed airfields, radio stations, and oil storage facilities. Darwin was burning on all sides. It seemed the city was being wiped off the map. No defense, no interceptions, only fire and death from the sky. When it was all over, when the last Japanese planes had disappeared over the horizon, the city lay in ruins. But the worst was yet to come. The worst was the silence. A silence that lasted 4 decades. The Australian government immediately issued censorship orders. Newspapers were ordered to report that only 17 people had died. Photographs of the devastation were destroyed. Evidence was erased. And the survivors, who had witnessed this horror with their own eyes, couldn't talk about it. Not even to friends, not even to family. Why? Why did one of the world's greatest democratic powers decide to hide the truth? Let's figure out how it happened. Let's go back a few months, to the time when Japan began its march south, when the entire Pacific seemed doomed, and when Australia realized it was all alone. February 1942. The world has been burning for 2.5 years. Europe is almost completely under Nazi control. But the real horror for the Allies began only recently, on December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. In the 3 months following this attack, the Japanese Empire had seized more territory than any army in human history. Look at the map of that time. Hong Kong had fallen. Malaysia was occupied. The Philippines were under Japanese control. The Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, was completely overrun. And the worst thing for the British happened on February 15th, 1942, just 4 days before the bombing of Darwin. Singapore had fallen. Singapore, an impregnable fortress, the jewel of the British Empire in Asia, the main naval base from India to Australia. 80,000 Allied soldiers surrendered to the Japanese. It was the greatest capitulation in British history. Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster in British military history. But for Australia, the fall of Singapore meant more than just a military defeat. It meant they were left completely alone. Imagine, the nearest Allied base was now thousands of kilometers away. The British fleet had withdrawn to India. The American fleet was nursing its wounds from Pearl Harbor, and Japanese forces were advancing ever closer south every day. By early February 1942, the Japanese had occupied East Timor, just 500 kilometers from the Australian coast, 500 kilometers. A plane can fly that distance in an hour. The Australians could see the smoke from Japanese ships off their shores. Enemy submarines patrolled the Australian coast. Fear hung in the air. But the worst part was that no one in Australia knew what to do. Most of the Australian army was in Africa, fighting the Germans. Those left at home were mostly reservists, new recruits, and militia. The military industry was just beginning to develop. Air defense systems were primitive or non-existent. Darwin was a strategic hub in this situation, the only major port in the north of the continent, a place where the Allies could refuel ships, repair aircraft, and store ammunition. From here, supplies were sent to the American troops in the Philippines, the few who still held out in the jungle. From here, the British evacuated refugees from Singapore and Indonesia. By February 1942, Darwin's population was about 2,000. It was a small provincial town with one main street, a few shops, a post office, and 2 hotels. People lived quietly and peacefully here, many working for the government or at the port. Children attended the only school. In the evenings, families gathered around the radio, listening to news of the war broadcast somewhere far away. None of them suspected that the Japanese command had been studying Darwin's maps for weeks. That in the offices of military planners in Tokyo, the city was marked with a red X. That Admiral Nagumo, the hero of Pearl Harbor, had already received orders to strike the Australian coast. On February 17, 1942, 2 days before the disaster, the Japanese fleet set course south. February 15, 1942. That day forever changed the balance of power in the Pacific. Singapore, a fortress the British had considered impregnable, fell after a week of fighting. 80,000 Allied soldiers surrendered to the Japanese. It was a humiliation of unimaginable proportions. The British Empire, which had dominated the seas for centuries and controlled half the globe, lost its main base in Asia. Winston Churchill, upon receiving news of the surrender, was both furious and despairing. He wrote in his memoirs that it was the worst blow he had ever suffered as Prime Minister. Singapore was a symbol of British power. Its loss meant that Japan now controlled the entire Southeast Asian region. Malaysia, Burma, Indonesia, the Philippines, all were now under the Japanese flag. But what did this mean for Australia? For ordinary Australians, living on the other side of the world and always believing Britain would protect them, it meant horror. Because if Singapore had fallen, if the region's most powerful fortress couldn't hold out for even a month, then what could stop the Japanese from invading Australia? Panic gripped the country. In Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, people began building bomb shelters in their gardens. Shops were emptied. People were buying up canned goods, water, and blankets. The government began evacuating children from coastal towns inland. Newspapers were filled with headlines about the Japanese threat. People were afraid to go out after dark. The Australian government was desperate to bring back its troops from Europe and Africa. Tens of thousands of Australian soldiers had fought in the deserts of Libya and Egypt, defending British interests. Now their homeland was under threat, and they were thousands of miles away. Australian Prime Minister John Curtin appealed to Britain to bring the troops home. Churchill refused. He said the troops were needed in Burma, and Australia must endure. It was a breaking point. For the first time in its history, Australia realized Britain wouldn't come to its aid. It was on its own. In desperation, Curtin turned to America. He wrote an open letter that shocked the British government. Australia looks to America, free from any shackles that bind us to traditional ties with Britain. It was almost a betrayal in London's eyes. But for Curtin, it was the only way out. Meanwhile, Japanese troops continued their advance. After the fall of Singapore, they landed on Java, captured Bali, and occupied Rabaul in New Guinea, just 3,000 kilometers from Sydney. Then they took East Timor. Now, only the sea remained between Japan and Australia. Enemy submarines began appearing off the Australian coast. They attacked merchant ships and sank cargo vessels. One day, a Japanese submarine fired at a lighthouse on the coast of New South Wales. It was a symbolic shot. The war had come to Australia's shores, and everyone understood this was only the beginning. The situation in Darwin was particularly tense. The city became the main transit point for the evacuation of refugees from Indonesia and Singapore. Thousands of people, women, children, wounded soldiers, arrived at the port on overcrowded ships. They told horrific stories of Japanese atrocities, bombings, and the massacre of civilians. These stories heightened the fear. The military command understood that Darwin was an obvious target. It was the only major port in the north, through which Allied supplies passed. American warships were based there, and Australian and British aircraft were moored there. Logically, the Japanese were bound to strike Darwin. But no one believed it would happen so soon or so brutally. Darwin, a city few people outside Australia knew about. A small port at the edge of the world, where temperatures rarely dropped below 30 degrees Celsius, where crocodiles slithered along the riverbanks, and the nearest large city was over 3,000 kilometers away. But in early 1942, this forgotten corner of the continent became one of the most important strategic points for the Allies in the Pacific. Why Darwin? Let's look at a map. The city is located in the northernmost part of Australia, just 500 kilometers from Japanese-occupied Timor. It was the closest Allied port to the war zone. From here, the Americans could supply their troops in the Philippines, where General MacArthur was still trying to hold out. From here, the Australian Air Force could conduct reconnaissance flights over Japanese positions in Indonesia. By February 1942, between 30 and 45 ships were permanently docked in Darwin Port. Cargo ships, tankers, naval destroyers, and ammunition transports. It was unbelievable chaos. Ships came and went every day, loading fuel, making repairs, and taking on refugees or soldiers. The docks worked around the clock. The dock workers were exhausted. Dozens of Allied aircraft were based at two airfields near the city: American P-40 Kitty Hawks, Australian Wirraways, and British Hudson bombers. True, most of them were obsolete aircraft, no longer fit for the war in Europe. Australia received what was left over from more high-priority fronts, but at least it was something. The town itself housed warehouses with ammunition, fuel, and food supplies. A 200-bed hospital treated the wounded evacuated from the islands. A radio station provided communication with American command. Oil storage facilities, without which the fleet could not operate. In short, Darwin was the nerve center of the entire Allied operation in the region, and the Japanese understood this perfectly well. Their intelligence had long been monitoring port activity. Submarines regularly reported on ship movements. Agents on the occupied islands transmitted information on troop and aircraft numbers. Tokyo knew that if Darwin were destroyed, the Allies would lose their only supply base in the north. The Americans in the Philippines would be left without support. Australia would be completely isolated. But there was something else too: a psychological factor. Japan wanted to show Australia that it was defenseless, that the British Navy would not come to its aid, that the Americans were too weak to protect their allies. The attack on Darwin was meant to break the Australian spirit, force them to capitulate or at least cease resistance. The attack plan was personally developed by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same man who had commanded the raid on Pearl Harbor 3 months earlier. He was one of Japan's most talented naval strategists. He knew how to strike without the enemy even having time to react. His carrier force had already routed the Americans in Hawaii, sunk British battleships off the coast of Malaya, and bombed Rabaul. Now Nagumo was ordered to destroy Darwin. On February 17, 1942, a Japanese strike group departed from its base on the island of Palau. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, were the very ships from which the aircraft launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. On their decks stood the best pilots in the Japanese fleet, aces with dozens of combat sorties under their belts. They had already tasted victory. They believed themselves invincible. American intelligence knew the Japanese fleet was somewhere nearby. A convoy of ships heading south had been spotted several days earlier, but the exact location of the aircraft carriers was unknown. Radio intercepts detected Japanese transmitter activity, but the messages were not deciphered in time. Allied command was on edge, but no specific orders were received. And in Darwin itself, life went on as usual. Yes, people knew there was a war going on. Yes, they saw ships in the harbor and planes in the sky. But no one believed the Japanese would dare strike Australian soil. It seemed impossible. Australia wasn't a small island that could be captured in a week. It was a continent. There were millions of people here. The Japanese wouldn't come here. This overconfidence will come at a very high price. The operation to destroy Darwin was prepared with the same meticulousness as the raid on Pearl Harbor. Admiral Nagumo left nothing to chance. He knew that the more precise the strike, the fewer losses his pilots would suffer, and the greater the destruction inflicted on the enemy. The plan was simple and deadly effective. Launch two powerful strikes, several hours apart, to prevent the enemy from organizing a defense. The first attack wave was to consist of 188 aircraft from 4 carriers. 0 fighters would provide cover for the bombers and torpedo bombers. Val dive bombers were to attack ships in port and military installations on shore. Kate torpedo bombers, the same machines that sank the American battleships at Pearl Harbor, were to destroy the larger vessels. It was a proven strategy that had already proven its effectiveness. The second wave was being prepared from land-based airfields on occupied Ambon Island and in East Timor. Another 54 heavy bombers were scheduled to strike a few hours after the first raid. By then, the port would already be a burning chaos, and the defenders would be in panic. The second wave was to finish off what remained: airfields, fuel depots, radio stations, everything that allowed Darwin to function as a military base. Japanese intelligence had been gathering information about Darwin for weeks. Submarines reported the number of ships in port. Agents relayed information about the location of anti-aircraft batteries, the flight schedules of Allied aircraft, and the size of the garrison. The Japanese knew almost everything. They knew that Darwin's air defenses were weak, that interceptor aircraft were few, that the early warning system was practically non-functional. The pilots selected for this operation were the best of the best. Many of them had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, bombed British bases in Malaya, and sunk ships off the coast of Java. These were no rookies. They were professional killers, trained to perfection. Each knew their target. Each understood that the success of the entire operation depended on their precision. On February 18th, the day before the attack, the Japanese carrier force was 400 kilometers northwest of Darwin. The ships were steaming at full speed, trying to get as close to the launch site as possible. Nagumo was calm. The weather was favorable: clear skies, good visibility, light winds, ideal conditions for an airstrike. That same day, Japanese bombers from airfields on Ambon and Timor conducted training flights. Pilots practiced their routes, checked their navigation equipment, and studied maps. Squadron commanders held final briefings. Everyone knew tomorrow would be a big day. Tomorrow, Australia would learn the true meaning of Japanese might. And what about the Allies? Did they really know nothing at all? In fact, there were warnings. A few days ago, an Australian reconnaissance aircraft spotted Japanese ships north of Timor. Radio intercepts recorded increased Japanese transmitter activity in the region. Even locals on the island saw large formations of ships heading south. But the information didn't reach Darwin in time. Or it did, but wasn't taken seriously. Command believed the Japanese were most likely preparing for an operation in Java or New Guinea. The idea that they might strike Australia itself seemed too bold. Why risk their carriers by approaching so close to enemy shores? This logic proved fatally flawed. The Allies thought like Western militaries: cautiously, prudently and risk-averse. But the Japanese thought differently. For them, risk was part of strategy. Surprise, aggression, and lightning strikes. That's what brought victory, and they were willing to take those risks. On the evening of February 18th, Darwin experienced a typical tropical sunset. The sun was setting over the sea, painting the sky red and orange. Workers were finishing their shifts at the port. Soldiers were returning to their barracks. Families were eating dinner. Children were playing in the streets. The radio broadcast news of the war in Europe and the islands. No one knew that several hundred kilometers away, hundreds of Japanese pilots were getting ready for bed, knowing that tomorrow they would bomb this city. The night passed peacefully. Darwin slept. A few sentries were on duty at the port. Aircraft were stationed at the airfields, but the pilots were asleep. Anti-aircraft gunners dozed by their guns. The few radars that existed were operating at half capacity. No one expected an attack. At dawn on February 19th, bustle erupted on the decks of the Japanese carriers. Technicians prepared aircraft, refilled fuel tanks, and attached bombs and torpedoes. Pilots donned flight suits, checked maps, and received final instructions. At 8:45 a.m., the first Zero revved its engine and rolled toward the runway. Then came the second, third, 10th, and 100th. One after another, 188 aircraft took to the skies and headed south. February 19th, 1942, Thursday, a typical workday in Darwin. The sun rose around 6 in the morning, bright and fast, as it always does in the tropics. By 7 o'clock, the temperature had risen to 28 degrees Celsius, and it was clear it would be a hot day. Humidity hung in the air, as it always does during the rainy season. People were waking up, washing, eating breakfast, and getting ready for work. The port was bustling with the usual morning bustle. Dock workers were unloading cargo ships, cranes creaked, and truck engines roared. There were 46 ships in the harbor, more than usual. The American destroyer Peary, several Australian corvettes, transport ships, tankers, and cargo barges were also present. The American transport Mayhar, loaded with ammunition and fuel, was moored at anchor. A dangerous cargo, but in wartime conditions, there was no choice. Workers were loading crates of food onto a ship bound for Timor to support the last pockets of Allied resistance. Some smoked on the dock, some drank coffee from thermoses, and still others joked and laughed. It was work like any other, hard, hot, but familiar. None of these people knew that within a few hours, many of them would be dead. At the airfield near Darwin Air Force Base, duty pilots sat in the shade of a hangar, sheltering from the morning sun. Several American P-40s stood ready for takeoff, but no orders had come. Australian Werraways, light training aircraft good for little more than reconnaissance, stood in neat rows on the airfield. Technicians checked engines and refilled tanks, the usual routine. In the city, children were going to school. Women were opening shops. The post office was starting its work. On the main street, a few cars slowly drove past wooden houses with verandas. Darwin was small. Everyone knew everyone. If someone was sick, the whole town knew about it. If someone had a baby, it was the news of the day. At the military hospital, nurses were preparing for a typical day. Several wounded men evacuated from the islands lay in wards. Some had malaria, some had shrapnel wounds, some simply exhaustion. Doctors were making their rounds. Everything was calm, almost peaceful. At 9:15 a.m., an operator at a radar station located a few kilometers outside the city noticed something strange on the screen. A large group of objects was approaching from the north. A very large group. He called headquarters and reported the contact. The duty officer listened and said, "It's probably the Americans returning from training exercises. Keep watching." The radio operator attempted to contact the approaching aircraft by radio. There was no answer. The objects continued to move south, directly toward Darwin. The distance was closing. The radio operator called headquarters again. This time, his voice was alarmed. They're not responding, and there are a lot of them, more than 100. The officer at headquarters paused. More than 100 aircraft? The Allies had no such formations in the region. Perhaps a radar error? Perhaps a flock of birds. Such things had happened. He ordered the fighter squadron on alert to scramble for an inspection. 4 P-40s were ordered to take off and find out who was flying. At 9:35 a.m., American fighter jets took off. The pilots climbed, scanning the northern sky. The weather was clear, visibility excellent. And then they saw it. A black cloud on the horizon. Hundreds of dots moving in formation. They weren't birds. They were planes. Lots of planes. The flight leader turned on the radio and shouted, "Base, it's the Japanese. I repeat, it's the Japanese. A huge formation is heading straight for us." His voice trembled with fear and adrenaline. He had never seen so many planes at once. The sky was filled with them, and they were all heading for Darwin. Panic broke out at headquarters. An officer grabbed the phone and started calling all units. "Raise all aircraft. Put anti-aircraft batteries on alert. Sound the air raid alarm." But it was too late. The Japanese were already almost over the city. At 9:58 a.m., sirens blared in Darwin. A long, alarming wail echoed across the city. People in the streets stopped and looked up. A siren? A drill? No, it couldn't be. Drills were usually announced in advance. Workers at the port dropped their tools and began looking around. Soldiers at the base ran out of their barracks. What was going on? And then they saw it. From the north, over the horizon, they appeared. At first, small dots, then larger and larger. A precise formation of planes, glittering in the sun. They flew low, from the sea, and there were so many of them that it seemed as if the sky itself was moving. Someone on the dock shouted, "It's ours! The Americans have arrived!" Several people even waved their arms, celebrating the reinforcements. But the joy lasted only a second, because ahead of the formation flew Zero fighters with red circles on their wings. And by the time they saw it, when they realized it was the enemy, it was too late to run. The first bomb fell on the port at 9:58:30. The explosion was deafening. The water column rose tens of meters. Then the second fell. The third. The 10th. The 20th. The sky filled with the roar of engines, the whistle of falling bombs, the roar of explosions. Hell has fallen upon Darwin. The first seconds of the attack were the most terrifying. Not because they were the bloodiest, that would come later, but because people didn't understand what was happening. Their brains refused to believe it was real. Bombs fell from the sky. Explosions shook the ground. But many still stood there, dumbfounded, looking up, trying to comprehend. War had come here, to Darwin, to Australian soil. Japanese Val dive bombers attacked first. They came in waves of 20 to 30 aircraft each. The planes would dive at a steep angle, engines howling at full throttle, and at the last moment, 300 meters above the ground, they would release their bombs. The accuracy was terrifying. The Japanese pilots had trained for years, and now that training meant death for everyone below. The first strikes hit the ships in port. The American destroyer Peary took a direct hit to the bow. The explosion tore through the deck, killing dozens of sailors instantly. The ship began to list. The crew attempted to organize a damage control operation, but it was futile. A second bomb hit the engine room. The Peary sank 15 minutes later. The Australian sloop Swan opened fire with her anti-aircraft guns, trying to fight back. Her sailors worked like mad, loading shells and aiming at the Japanese planes. But their guns were too slow, and the Japanese were too fast. The bombers attacked the Swan again and again. One bomb hit the stern, a second, amidships. A third ruptured a boiler room. The ship was enveloped in steam and smoke. The crew began to evacuate, jumping into the water, but many drowned, caught in the eddy current from the sinking vessel. Kate torpedo bombers targeted large transport vessels. These machines were especially dangerous. They carried 800-kilogram torpedoes capable of ripping any ship in half. The pilots flew low over the water, almost skimming the waves, to avoid radar detection. Then, a sharp release of the torpedo, and a white trail across the water, rushing toward the target. The American transport Mehar, packed with ammunition and aviation fuel, was doomed from the first second of the attack. A torpedo struck the side, and what happened next was remembered by all survivors. The explosion was monstrous. The ship literally shattered into pieces. A mushroom cloud of fire rose hundreds of meters into the sky. The shockwaves shattered windows in houses on the shore a kilometer from the port. Shipwreckage scattered in all directions, falling into the water, onto docks, and onto neighboring ships. The dock workers on the quays began to flee. Some jumped into the water, trying to swim away from the burning ships. Others ran to warehouses, hoping to find shelter behind the concrete walls. But bombs were falling everywhere. One struck a group of workers trying to hide behind a truck. The explosion scattered their bodies like rag dolls. Meanwhile, Zero fighters swept over the city, shooting at anything that moved. They fired at trucks, at cars, at fleeing people. Machine gun fire tore up the ground, shattered windows, and swept through the streets. One woman was running with a child in her arms, trying to reach a bomb shelter. A burst of fire caught her in the back. She fell, shielding the child with her body. The child survived. The airfield was in chaos. Most of the Australian aircraft were parked in the open, easy targets. Japanese bombers methodically destroyed them one by one. Bombs exploded among the planes, turning them into burning scrap metal. Fuel ignited, spreading the flames. Hangars burned. Ammunition depots detonated, sending shrapnel flying in all directions. The few American P-40s that had managed to take off before the attack began attempted to engage. But there were 4 of them against 188 Japanese aircraft. One P-40 managed to shoot down a Japanese bomber, the first Japanese loss in the attack. But seconds later, 3 Zeros pounced on it. The American pilot tried to escape, but his plane was riddled with machine gun fire. The plane billowed with smoke and began to fall. The pilot bailed out, but was killed by a shot from a Zero while still in the air. In the city, people hid wherever they could. Some hid under beds, some lay in ditches, some ran away from the city into the bush, into the jungle, wherever their eyes could find them. Bombs fell on residential buildings, on a school, on a hospital. Yes, on a hospital. The building with a huge red cross on the roof was deliberately bombed. The Japanese pilots either didn't see the cross or didn't pay attention to it. The explosion destroyed the operating room, where an emergency operation was being performed on a wounded soldier. The doctor, the nurses, the patient, all died. The Allied anti-aircraft batteries fired with all their might, but it was like shooting a slingshot at an airplane. Shells exploded in the sky, but the Japanese flew so fast and skillfully that hitting them was nearly impossible. Furthermore, many of the anti-aircraft gunners were poorly trained. Some fired at their own planes, mistaking them for the enemy. The attack lasted 20 minutes, just 20 minutes of hell. But in those 20 minutes, the Japanese destroyed 8 ships, burned 20 planes, destroyed dozens of buildings, and killed hundreds of people. The port became a blazing inferno. Black smoke rose in kilometer-long columns. The cries of the wounded, the wail of sirens, and the roar of explosions merged into one continuous nightmare. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it all stopped. The Japanese planes turned and flew north, back to the carriers. Only smoke remained in the sky. Below, a burning city, sinking ships, hundreds of dead and wounded, and a terrible silence after the inferno. People began to crawl out of their shelters, looking around, trying to understand what had happened. Some were crying, some were calling for help, some were simply standing in shock, staring at the destruction. Many thought, it's all over. The worst is over. They were wrong. As the Japanese planes disappeared over the horizon, an eerie silence descended on the city. Not complete. Ships were burning, ammunition was exploding, the wounded were screaming. But that special silence after a catastrophe, when the brain can't yet comprehend the scale of what has happened. People stood amid the ruins, covered in dust and blood, looking around with glassy eyes. The port was a scene of apocalypse. The water in the harbor was ablaze. Spilled fuel from the sunken ships had turned it into a lake of fire. Those ships still afloat were engulfed in flames. The bodies of sailors lay on the decks. Some were still trying to save their vessels, pumping water and throwing burning debris overboard, but it was futile. One by one, the ships capsized and sank. The surviving sailors swam in the burning water, trying to reach shore. Many were wounded, burned, and in shock. Some helped their comrades, some swam alone, and still others simply clung to the wreckage, unable to move. Those who made it to shore collapsed onto the docks and lay there, gasping for breath, watching their ships sink. A dead dock worker lay on pier number 3, his body buried beneath the debris of a crane. Torn sacks of flour mixed with blood and water lay nearby. A little further on lay an overturned truck, the driver's arm sticking out of the cab. Bodies were everywhere. Some recognizable, others just pieces of flesh. No one counted the dead. There was no time. Rescuers began converging on the port. Fire trucks arrived first, but what help could they provide? The water was burning. The ships were burning. The oil and ammunition depots were burning. The firefighters unwound their hoses, pumped water, and tried to contain the fire, but it was like spitting on a fire. The situation in the city was no better. Bombs destroyed dozens of houses. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Wooden houses burned like matchsticks. The tropical heat and dryness had taken their toll. People tried to save their belongings, carrying out furniture, photographs, and children. Some rummaged through the rubble, searching for loved ones. Screams, cries, and moans. They were the soundtrack of the disaster. The hospital was overflowing within minutes. The wounded were transported by car, carried in arms, and dragged on stretchers. There were catastrophically few doctors and nurses. The operating room, the one that had survived the bombing, worked non-stop. The surgeon operated on one patient after another, his hands bloodied to the elbows, uncertain whether he would be able to save even half of them. The wounded lay on the floor in the corridors. Some had shrapnel wounds, some had third-degree burns, some had shattered bones. Some screamed in pain, some were silent in shock. Some were quietly dying while the doctors were busy tending to those who could still be saved. A nurse tried to bandage a wounded man's stomach, but he died right in her arms. She didn't cry. There was no time for tears. Command was paralyzed. Officers tried to contact their subordinates, but communications were down. The radio station was destroyed. Telephone lines were down. Some commanders simply got into cars and drove out of the city, abandoning their men. This wasn't a mass exodus, but there were cases of officers disappearing at the most critical moment. Ordinary soldiers and civilians did what they could. Some cleared rubble, trying to find survivors. Some organized the evacuation of the wounded. Still others simply helped people escape from destroyed homes. Heroism was evident where command was absent. An Australian sergeant organized a group of soldiers and began putting out a fire at an ammunition depot. They knew that if the depot exploded, half the city would go with it. They hosed down the depot, risking their lives, because the ammunition had already begun to detonate. Boxes of ammunition, grenades, and mines exploded. Shrapnel flew around, but they continued pumping water. The depot didn't explode. These men saved hundreds of lives, and no one ever knew their names. Panic erupted in the streets. People loaded their belongings into cars and drove away from the city. The roads became clogged. Some headed south, into the interior of the continent. Others simply drove wherever their eyes took them, just to get away from this hell. Families abandoned their homes, everything they'd acquired over the years, and fled. Fear was the strongest of all. But many stayed. Some because they had nowhere to run, some because they didn't want to leave the city, some because they needed to help the wounded. And these people, those who stayed, witnessed what happened next. Around midday, someone in the street shouted, "They're coming back!" Everyone froze. People looked up at the sky. No, it couldn't be. There couldn't be a second raid, could there? But the sound was unmistakable, the roar of aircraft engines. From the north again, dots appeared. They were heavy bombers, flying in formation. 54 aircraft. A second wave. And then the real horror began. Because the first raid had destroyed the defenses, and the second was supposed to destroy what remained. And the people no longer had the strength to flee. They simply lay down on the ground, covered their heads with their hands, and prayed. The second wave arrived at 11:58 a.m., exactly 2 hours after the first raid. 54 Mitsubishi G4M heavy bombers, nicknamed Betty by the Allies, took off from land-based airfields on the Japanese-occupied islands of Ambon and Timor. They carried tons of bombs and had one goal: to destroy whatever had survived the initial attack. Military installations, airfields, warehouses, radio stations, everything that kept Darwin functioning. The people below could no longer run. Many were wounded, many were in shock, many were simply physically exhausted after 2 hours of rescue efforts. When the sirens sounded, when Japanese bombers appeared overhead, most simply lay down where they were. Some huddled in the bomb craters of the first wave, a terrible irony, hiding in the remains of the previous attack. Some crawled under the rubble of buildings. Some simply closed their eyes and waited for the end. The Japanese bombers were flying high, at an altitude of 4,000 to 5,000 meters, beyond the range of anti-aircraft fire. They flew in tight formation, like a parade, unhurried, methodical. Below, Darwin was already burning after the first raid, and the pilots navigated by the smoke. They didn't even need maps. Just look for the smoke and drop your bombs there. The first bombs fell on the military airfield. What remained of the aircraft after the initial raid was completely destroyed. The hangars, which had been burning, were now simply wiped off the face of the earth. The runway was pockmarked with craters. It was now impossible to take off from there. The aviation fuel depot exploded, sending a mushroom cloud of fire into the sky. The temperatures were so high that metal melted. The next target was the radio station. It was a strategic building. It was the primary communications link between Darwin and the rest of Australia, between Darwin and the American command. The Japanese knew where it was. Several bombers separated from the main group and headed for the radio station. The bombs fell accurately. The building vanished in a fiery explosion. The antenna collapsed. Communications were lost. Now Darwin was cut off from the world. The oil storage facilities became the next target. Enormous fuel tanks stood on the outskirts of the city. They were already burning after the first airstrike, but the Japanese decided to ensure their destruction. The bombs fell one after another. The tanks exploded with a roar that could be heard tens of kilometers away. Rivers of fire flowed across the land, igniting everything in their path. Black, oily smoke rose so high that it was visible from the mainland, 200 kilometers away. But the worst thing was that the Japanese were bombing residential areas again. Perhaps by accident, perhaps not. But bombs fell on houses, on streets, on people. One residential block was practically wiped off the face of the earth. Wooden houses exploded and burned like torches. A family of 5 was hiding in a basement. A bomb hit the house directly, and the basement became their grave. The school, which had miraculously survived the initial airstrike, was now devastated. Fortunately, there were no children there. They had been evacuated immediately after the initial attack. But the building where they had studied, played, and grown up was reduced to a pile of bricks and rubble. The anti-aircraft batteries fired, but to no avail. The Japanese bombers were flying too high. The shells exploded far below, missing their targets. The anti-aircraft gunners worked to the point of exhaustion, loading, firing, loading again. But not a single aircraft was shot down. It was torture, firing and knowing it was useless. One Australian soldier manning an anti-aircraft gun later recalled, "We fired and cried in frustration. We saw the bombs falling on our people, on our homes, and we could do nothing. Nothing. It was the worst day of my life." The second wave of the attack lasted 25 minutes. During this time, the Japanese dropped tens of tons of more bombs. They destroyed everything of military value, and much that was not. When they turned and flew back north, a dead city was left below. Darwin was no longer a military base. It was no longer a port. It was a ruin. Black smoke obscured the sky, making the daytime as dark as twilight. Fire raged everywhere. In the port, at the airfield, in warehouses, in residential areas. There wasn't enough water to put out all the fires, and people simply watched as their city burned. When the siren sounded the all clear, when the Japanese planes disappeared over the horizon, people began to crawl out of their shelters. Many couldn't stand. Their legs wouldn't hold them up. Some sat, hugging their knees, rocking back and forth, staring into space. Some cried. Some simply remained silent. The command tried to assess the damage. How many had died? No one knew. Dozens. Hundreds. Thousands. Bodies lay everywhere. In the port. In the streets. Under the rubble. Many were burned so badly they were unrecognizable. Many had been torn apart by explosions. Many had drowned in the burning waters of the port, their bodies yet to surface. There were even more wounded. The hospital physically couldn't take them all. People were dying right in the streets because there was no one to treat them. Doctors worked 20 hours straight until they collapsed from exhaustion. There were not enough medicines, not enough bandages, not enough morphine. The wounded screamed in pain, but there was nothing to help them with. By evening, a mass exodus from the city began. No longer panicked, but organized. Military trucks carried the wounded south. Civilian cars carried families. Some walked, carrying children and suitcases. The roads were clogged. People fled from the specter of another attack, from the fear that the Japanese would return again. And the Japanese never returned. Not that day. But they would return later. They would bomb Darwin 63 more times during the war. But that first day, February 19, 1942, will be remembered as the worst. As the day Australia learned that war wasn't somewhere far away, but here. When the dust settled and the fire began to die down, when headquarters began to analyze what had happened, everyone was haunted by one question. How did this happen? How were the Japanese able to simply fly in and bomb an Australian city with virtual impunity? Why did the defense collapse so quickly and so completely? The answer was bitter, because there was no system. There was a semblance of defense. There were individual elements, but a coherent, functioning defense system simply did not exist. Let's start at the very beginning, with the early warning. The Allies in Darwin had a radar, just one, the only radar for the entire northern region of Australia. It spotted the Japanese aircraft 45 minutes before the attack. The operator saw a huge formation coming from the north. He reported it to headquarters. And what happened? Nothing. The duty officer decided it was probably the Americans returning from training. He didn't raise the alarm. He didn't order fighters to scramble. He simply said, "Keep watching." It was a fatal mistake, but it was a symptom of a deeper problem. The command didn't believe the Japanese would dare attack Australia. All instructions, all defense plans, were based on the assumption that the threat was somewhere far away, on the islands, in Indonesia, but not here. When reality didn't match expectations, the commanders chose not to believe reality. The second radio operator continued to monitor the approaching aircraft. When they were already 50 kilometers from the city, he called headquarters again. This time, his voice was alarmed. "They're not responding to calls. There are over 100 of them. This can't be a drill." Only then was the order given to scramble the fighters. But it was too late. 4 P-40s took off 20 minutes before the attack. 4 fighters against 188 Japanese aircraft. This wasn't combat. It was suicide. Where were the other planes? Why wasn't there a ready standby unit in the air? The answer is simple. No fuel. Most of the aviation fuel was used to support operations on the islands. What remained was saved for critical situations. But when the critical situation arose, the fuel was in the wrong place, in the wrong quantity, and it couldn't be delivered to the planes in time. The anti-aircraft defenses were even worse. Darwin had several anti-aircraft batteries, but they were outdated. They were World War I-era guns that fired slowly and inaccurately. Their maximum altitude was about 3,000 meters. The Japanese bombers of the second wave were flying at 5,000 meters. The anti-aircraft gunners fired into the sky, knowing their shells simply wouldn't reach them. But even these few guns weren't ready. Ammunition was stored not at the batteries, but in depots several kilometers away. When the attack began, the anti-aircraft gunners wasted precious minutes fetching shells. And in those minutes, the Japanese managed to drop half their bombs. Worse, the anti-aircraft gunners were poorly trained. Many had been called up only a few months earlier and had received minimal training. They didn't know how to properly fire at moving targets. There were instances of them firing at their own aircraft, mistaking them for the enemy. One Australian fighter was hit by its own anti-aircraft gun and crashed into the sea. The pilot was killed. Communication between units was virtually non-existent. Radios operated on different frequencies. The Army couldn't contact the Navy. The Navy couldn't contact the Air Force. When the attack began, each unit operated independently, unaware of what the others were doing. It was an uncoordinated response, chaos. The commanders were unprepared for such a massive attack. There had been exercises, but they were merely pro forma. No one had simulated a situation in which 242 Japanese aircraft descended on the city. No one had practiced the mass evacuation of the wounded. No one had prepared a plan for the destruction of the radio station and the loss of communications. When all of this happened simultaneously, the commanders were at a loss. There were also cases of outright cowardice. Some officers abandoned their posts and fled the city. One mid-ranking commander got into a car during the first raid and drove south without giving a single order to his subordinates. He was found 2 days later, 200 kilometers from Darwin. He was demoted and court-martialed, but the damage was done. The unit was left leaderless at a critical moment. The soldiers also fled. Not all of them, but there were cases of mass desertion. After the second wave of attacks, hundreds of soldiers abandoned their weapons and fled the city into the bush. They walked south, hiding in the jungle, eating whatever they could find. Some were found weeks later, exhausted, sick, in shock. They weren't judged harshly. The command understood that they had been through hell and were simply psychologically broken. But the main reason for the failure of the defense was simpler and more terrible: underestimating the enemy. Australia wasn't prepared for a real war on its own soil. The war was somewhere far away, in Europe, Africa, the Pacific Islands. At home, on the continent, it was supposed to be safe. Britain would protect, America would help, Japan wouldn't dare. This confidence cost hundreds of lives. When the Japanese finally dared, when they arrived and bombed the city, it became clear there was nothing and no one to defend it. The ships in the port lacked adequate anti-aircraft cover. Aircraft were parked in the open, like targets. Ammunition and fuel depots were unprotected. The hospital, with its enormous red cross on the roof, was considered inviolable. But that didn't stop the Japanese. After the war, a commission of inquiry would be established. It would uncover dozens of errors, miscalculations, and instances of incompetence. Those responsible would be named. Conclusions would be drawn. But that would come later. On February 19, 1942, there was only one realization. Australia had found itself defenseless against an enemy that didn't play by the rules. The worst part began after the explosions died down and the Japanese planes departed. It wasn't the physical destruction. That could have been repaired. It wasn't the victims. They could have been buried. The worst part was the Australian government's decision to conceal the truth about what happened in Darwin on February 19, 1942. On the very day of the attack, Prime Minister John Curtin signed an order introducing military censorship. Everything related to the bombing of Darwin became a state secret. Newspapers received the strictest instructions to report only what was permitted. Photographers were to photograph only what was approved. Witnesses were to remain silent about what they saw. The official version was, Japanese aircraft attacked military installations in the Darwin area. The enemy suffered losses. Our losses were 17 killed. 17 people. When the actual death toll exceeded 250 on the first day alone, when hundreds lay in hospitals with wounds, when the entire city was in ruins, the government claimed 17 casualties. Why? Because the truth was too terrifying. Australia in 1942 was teetering on the brink of panic. The Japanese had seized half the Pacific Ocean, were approaching the Australian coast, and the population was already terrified. If people had learned that little Darwin had been practically wiped off the face of the earth in a single day, that its defenses had collapsed completely, that the city was defenseless, panic would have engulfed the entire country. The government feared a mass exodus from the northern regions. It feared that people would demand the return of troops from Europe and Africa. It feared anti-government protests. It feared that its allies, the Americans and the British, would lose confidence in Australia's ability to defend itself. So, it chose the path of lies. The censors worked mercilessly. Photographs of the destruction were confiscated and destroyed. Correspondents who tried to tell the truth were warned, and then their articles were simply not published. Military personnel were warned that discussing the scale of the tragedy was tantamount to disclosing military secrets and was punishable by imprisonment. Families of the victims were told that their loved ones died in the line of duty during an enemy attack, but details were withheld. Many families remained unaware for years of how their loved ones died. Some bodies were never found. They burned in the port, drowned at sea, or were buried under rubble. These people remained missing for decades. The survivors were effectively forced into silence. They were told that speaking out about what they had seen could help the enemy and harm the country's defense. Most believed it and remained silent. They remained silent at work, silent at home, silent even with close friends. The trauma was locked inside, and this crippled them psychologically for life. Children who survived the bombing grew up with nightmares, but couldn't talk about them. Women who lost their husbands grieved alone. Men who witnessed the hell of war turned to drink, but didn't reveal the cause of their problems. This silence led to tragedies in thousands of families. The world only learned the truth in the 1980s. 40 years later, archives were declassified, documents were published, witnesses were finally given the right to speak. It turned out that not 17, but more than 250 people died, that the city was almost completely destroyed, that the defense was useless, that the government lied to the country for 4 decades. By that time, many witnesses had already died. Many families never learned the truth about the fate of their loved ones. Many documents were lost or destroyed. History had to be pieced together, bit by bit, from the memories of elderly people and from photographs that had somehow survived. But when the truth finally came out, it shocked Australia. People learned that their country had survived one of the most horrific air attacks in history. That heroism and cowardice, courage and betrayal had coexisted side by side. That war had come to Australian soil and brought death, but no one had been told. Today, monuments to the victims stand in Darwin. A museum tells the true story of those days. Every year on February 19th, a remembrance ceremony is held. The names of the victims, names that had been kept secret for 40 years, are announced. Australians finally recognize their heroes. But the most important lesson of this story isn't about war. It's about truth. It's about how lies, even those with the best intentions, destroy more than the most terrible bombs. On February 19, 1942, the Japanese destroyed Darwin in a matter of hours. But the Australian government spent 40 years destroying the memory of that day. And the second destruction was worse than the first. Darwin was restored in a couple of years. Trust in the government took decades to restore, and it was never fully restored. They thought the war was somewhere far away. But on February 19, 1942, the war came to them, and then came the lies. And the lies hurt more than the war.